name's Miceal O'Hurley, and thank you for joining us again on In Conversation this week. Today we have a very special guest, Mr. Julian Radcliffe, OBE, Order of the British Empire for those of us who aren't British Anglophiles. He is a very distinguished gentleman who has a very interesting career, and we're going to hear more from him in a minute. Stay tuned.
You are watching In Conversation This Week with Miceal O'Hurley.
Julian, thank you for joining us on In Conversation this week.
I'm happy to do so.
Julian, tell me a little bit about yourself. You have a very interesting background.
Well, I read politics and economics at Oxford and became very interested in the whole problem of international terrorism and its relation to crime. And I ended up working at Lloyd's of London because they insured many of the ships, aircraft, oil rigs, and so on, which were becoming the targets at that time, mainly of the Palestinian terrorists. But later, of course, hijacking jets became virtually every terrorist's pastime. And I went to Lloyd's of London because I could see that the insurance world could have a significant effect on improving the risk management and providing a greater deterrence to that type of crime. And that they needed to find ways in which they could work with the government sector and the government find ways in which they could work with the private sector in order to get the best of both. And the whole of my career has been built really on the boundary between the two.
I see. What gave you a particular interest in lost, looted, or disputed art?
I can claim no credit for the idea of the international database. It was in fact Sotheby's who came to me when we were helping Sotheby's develop the protection of their personnel, some of whom were in rather exposed places in those days, like Argentina and Italy, where there was a significant risk of kidnap. And obviously to kidnap somebody who had a valuable picture and then use the picture as part of the negotiation for their release is the sort of thing in which one of my companies, Control Risks, was really the world leader. And Sotheby's came to me, and after we had done some work for them in relation to personnel, they said, can't you do something now about stolen art? And they had started in New York with a not-for-profit to develop a small database, but they'd really run out of management impetus and resources. And I said, we need the insurance world to support it. And they said, well, could you take it over?
So tell me here, we have artwork that's being used for blackmail, for kidnappings and ransom. And that's a kind of a gray world. There's certainly a crime being committed, but these things often get resolved in an extrajudicial way. And no one likes to talk about that, and for very good reasons. Has there been a huge exposure to insurance companies over this type of activity?
I think it's probably much larger in people's imagination than in fact the real numbers. Clearly in kidnapping, where there is a recognized market, and we, in my company, Control Risks, we advised in over 2,000 kidnap and piracy cases. Many of them were insured, and there was a very well worked out operating procedure between the insurance company, ourselves as the advisor, the local government, the family, the multinational employer, and all the other parties. So in relation to people, where of course it's much more serious than negotiations for the return of artifacts, however significant they may be, I think all of that has been well organized and is now relatively uncontroversial. Clearly, you have to reduce the amount of money paid. and you've got to respect the importance of the security services and intelligence and police in the country who are trying to counter these people. But for art and antiques, it's a slightly different matter. In many cases that we get involved in, the perpetrators of the crime have already been to jail. I've got a number of cases like that in Serbia, where the French police and other good police forces caught the people who did the robbery, but they did not get back the items. The items were moved to Serbia or Eastern Europe or Turkey or wherever. And the question then becomes, well, what should happen to those items? The police are not really that interested in getting the items back. It's a low priority for them compared to investigating and putting criminals behind bars. And there is clearly a reasonable supposition that the victim of crime or the insurer should be able to get back their assets and reduce their financial and, in some cases, emotional loss. So we are given a reasonable degree of discretion in negotiating for the return of items, provided that we keep the police informed if we find information or people or whatever which they may not know about. And if we don't get these items back, perhaps for a modest payment, then they may end up, of course, getting into the art and antiques market, where it becomes much more expensive to get them back, and many more people are going to lose money through having traded in them without having checked with us, and maybe they will find that they won't be able to recover the money they spent buying them. So there is quite a strong reason to get these items back at the earliest possible moment, and for hopefully for a lower payment than they would be able to get if they traded them anywhere else.
So let's talk about the art loss register for a second. How do items end up on the art loss register?
We take the details of lost and stolen items from the victims, who may be private individuals, museums, galleries, from the police, and from insurers, and from some public sources. We only will record an item on the database if there is a police crime reference number, and we check as much as we can that we are not being asked to take on items which weren't really stolen. We do accept items which are in dispute. They may be subject to a divorce, a trust, a will, a loan, something which means that the items, there is an argument about their ownership, and until that is resolved, they shouldn't be sold. And our aim is to use the power of the database to get people round the table to resolve the issue of title and to get the item returned to its rightful owner, maybe with a financial settlement. But often items get returned with no finance being involved at all.
Most of us are aware of the huge amount of art that was lost, looted, or disappeared during World War II, not only from the Jewish community, from whom it was stripped by the state, but museums which were looted by the state and individuals like Goering, Hitler, and others. Stalin took a lot of artwork back to Russia. Since those days, there's been a lot of work done in the international community and in the legal community about returning those items. How has that developed, and what more needs to be done given our knowledge of lost, looted, and disputed art that's been gathered since 75, 80 years ago?
The really important change in the return of items looted during World War II has been the recognition of the moral issue as compared to the strict legal issue. In very simplistic legal terms, because there is a limitation period in which title will pass to a good faith purchaser, 99% of the art looted by the Nazis is now in the hands of individuals who can claim a good faith purchase legally. But given the scale of the looting and the persecution of the Jewish and other owners, the moral issue of whether somebody would want to own that art unless they had come to a settlement with the original owner or their heirs means that those items are not saleable. And it is the inability to sell the item, i.e. you cannot find a buyer, that forces the current holder to come to a deal with the people who are claiming the original ownership. Now, interestingly enough, although that has really only been what I would call officially blessed in the Washington Principles by governments, that principle of the moral issue is now important in relation to items stolen conventionally. So if you have an example where there is a museum, say, which has got 6 pictures all hung up of the 6 doges of Venice or whatever, and one of them is stolen and 50 years later turns up in an auction, and everybody knows that it really should be back on the wall in the Doge Museum, then nobody's going to buy it. And so we use that moral and public relations issue to help settle cases which are not necessarily ones involving World War II. So that's been a very important development. And we have 5 German-speaking individuals here working full-time on World War II items. And indeed, I'm working on one today, which is a picture worth now $30 million, which was bought by a museum at the end of the war for $2,000. And the artist has become very sought after. And the item was taken from a Jewish dealer in Germany in the 1930s and sold by a Nazi, the wife of a Nazi, into America in the late 1940s.
That's very interesting. So there's a moral hazard for someone acquiring disputed artwork. Are auction houses referencing the art loss register before they'll put things in catalogs to avoid the embarrassment of having to withdraw items because of a dispute?
Absolutely. There are over 140 auction houses, including the leading auction houses in Ireland, who have every item that they wish to sell checked with us before the sale. And that is a very effective way for the auction houses to dissuade people from offering them items which the holder knows or suspects has a suspect provenance. And it gives comfort to the buyer that the auction house has undertaken the due diligence that should be required. And that may mean more than just checking with us. We are at least the minimum level, and we will, if we are asked to give a certificate, do more research than we can do for a quick on or off the database question prior to an auction, where we're obviously operating on a limited timescale. But many buyers now say to an auction when they buy a picture, we also want the art loss register certificate, and we will then provide additional research in order to try and make certain that there is a full provenance from the artist to date.
I'm thinking of the Gardner Museum and the number of museums who have had pieces stolen over the years. The art crime world is very sophisticated. Do you often come across documents for provenance that themselves turn out to be fraudulent?
Yes. As there has been increasing emphasis on the importance of provenance for several reasons, clearly provenance may help prove authenticity if you can show that the item came from the artist's studio direct to your ancestor. Secondly, provenance is a defense against somebody claiming ownership of the item. And thirdly, and perhaps in some ways most importantly, it adds to the story of the item. I mean, when I went to one of the major auction houses to discuss the sale of this $30 million picture the other day, the whole emphasis was on the story. It has a very interesting story. Clearly, anything that was in Germany prior to World War II, it has an interesting story. But the value of an item now is not just in its intrinsic artistic merit, it is also in the story that goes with it in terms of its ownership, location, exhibition, publication, and so on. So that is a very important part of the value of items.
Do most private collectors do enough documenting so that if a piece is stolen, there's enough information to list it on your register to help the police, to help in the recovery? Or is that still a shortfall for many owners of artwork?
Yes, sadly, it is a shortfall. Even in the days now when with a mobile telephone, you can take quite good photographs of items, people forget to take photographs of the back as well as the front of a picture, and the back with labels and stretchers and so on is a very important part of the evidence. They forget to take measurements, which is an important part for us, because pictures get cut down. It depends whether there is a large amount of canvas behind the picture frame. All of the descriptions that we need are often lacking when the item is stolen, and that makes it much more difficult to get it back. I would say that it's vastly improved in the last 10 years because of electronic information, but many people do not take the care of items they own, not just in photographing them, but in listing the family connection or how they bought it or where they bought it from. All of that is very important to the eventual value of an item.
And are you saying that can be done relatively easily, given the proliferation of smartphones?
Yes, it can be done relatively easily because you can now photograph and record your invoice, photograph the shop or the gallery you bought the piece of art in. All of that is important, but a lot of people forget that it's really important to their successors, to their children, grandchildren, to give a record of how items were obtained and what was the connection between an item and a member of the family. And you don't have to be a rich family for that to be of great interest. Any family where they survived COVID or fought in a war or emigrated or anything like that, people now in America spend huge sums of money researching the history of that sort of thing, and they could save themselves the time and trouble by recording it.
I want to move on to talk about states, artwork, and artifacts. You run a register of cultural items. What is that called, and tell me about it?
We run a database of stolen and looted art and antiques, and it's a very wide spectrum. So it's musical instruments, toys, antiquities, coins, medals, pictures, silver, furniture, the whole gamut. Any item which could be traded in the art and antiques market and which is uniquely describable can be put on our database. Now, we do not record some things, for example, wine and whiskey. However valuable, the bottles are not unique and therefore, or not uniquely describable, and therefore we cannot deal with them. We cannot deal with maybe very valuable prints, of which there may be hundreds of copies unless they're numbered. But nevertheless, we spend a huge amount of time and effort collecting this data and making certain that it's really accurate. Because our searching of over 500,000 items a year relies on an individual on our staff looking at the item which is being offered for sale, describing it on the keyboard, a man with two dogs looking at a river, etc. And then up on the screen come the nearest 30, 40, 50 images to that description. The member of staff will then look at those and see if there's a match, and then try a number of different descriptions of the picture, including its dimensions, its medium, potential, its artist, etc., to see if on our database of over 750,000 items, they can find a match. There are many near matches. You then have to ring up the person who is putting in the search and say to them, is there a chip in the left-hand corner, all that sort of thing. So this is a very time-consuming and labor-intensive work, but it's the only way in which we can ensure that every match is followed up. If we merely published our database, the criminals would be mighty pleased because they would be able to work out what we were looking for. This way, they don't know. And they're often surprised when we pounce because they didn't know the item was on the database. They may have been told it wasn't by somebody who was trying to sell it to them. And then we find that we can recover the item and get the intelligence from where it was. You cannot do that with a database such as Interpol publish, which is open to everybody to search with no follow-up.
And of course, I'm assuming the Interpol, the policing, law enforcement agencies aren't interested in publishing all of their knowledge because their goal is a prosecution and incarceration.
Correct.
So your database becomes indispensable in those cases.
Yes, I mean, the police run databases which essentially link together the crime and the item and the owner and their investigation, which of course should not be public. And they find it very difficult to take out the details of the item to make that available for searching. And that is obviously something that we do, and we don't hold the details of the police investigation, and we don't necessarily have to hold the details of the owner, because provided we can get to the owner if we find the item through the insurer or the police, that may be good enough. But since we recover items sometimes 300 years after they were stolen, it is good to have the name of the original owner because it saves a lot of research.
In preparing for the interview, I was sharing with my wife your background, your history, and your work. She described you somewhat of a Sherlock Holmes. You have very specific concentrations of knowledge in peculiar areas. You're an insurance person, you're quasi-legal, you're involved with crime, you crack open books and look for history records, you talk to people about their observations of art. It's really quite an interesting background, Julian. I want to talk about a comment you just made about items from 300 years ago. We have today a set of laws that say that art should be returned in principle to its original owners if it was wrongfully deprived of them. Is that a fair statement?
Yes, that is a fair statement.
Okay. I've not been to a museum in my lifetime, and I've been to many. Whether I was a student in Rome or touring in France or in Mexico, that didn't contain artworks that had been looted by Napoleon, Holy Roman emperors, popes. These items were taken hundreds of years ago, to the point where they have almost become the fabric or part of the fabric of the country in which they've resided in a museum. How do you resolve ownership issues like that? And I'm leading us to the Parthenon marbles. How do we resolve these kind of issues? Are we back to moral obligations?
The answer is we're back to moral obligations partly. But there are, of course, many other factors at play. One is purely political. One is the whole question of tourist dollars and what can be made in terms of revenue out of museums and these items being displayed. I mean, for example, I've been involved with the exhibition, which is at the LVMH Great New Museum in Paris, where we expect to have 1.2 million visitors to the wonderful Impressionist collection of pictures, which were assembled in Russia and then confiscated essentially by the Russian government. Now, that was an act by a government against its own citizens. But what of the opposite, which is where a foreign government comes in and takes items owned either privately by a tribe or owned by a state? And the answer is that we will not be able to reverse all those bad actions, because there simply would not be the museum capacity in those countries to hold these items. And they would not necessarily want all of them back, because many of them are copies or not of huge significance. But what we've got to do on the important items is to work out deals, as it were, whereby the item, we don't argue so much about the ownership of the item, we argue about where it can be exhibited, what are the financial terms, what are the best ways in which they can be conserved and studied. All of these other issues are very important, and the original country from which, the source country from which they were taken, needs to be helped to educate itself and its tourists and its people about these items without necessarily having to own them. They need to be able to see images of them, to be able to exhibit them sometimes physically. The ownership item, the ownership issue, is really an emotional one and not really a very important one if you're trying to resolve these things and improve the world.
Germany recently returned the Benin bronzes. Egypt repatriated stolen art to Israel. This isn't an uncommon occurrence these days. The question I have is, how often do diplomats get dragged into those kind of issues? Are they by nature involved because they are cross-border disputes?
We quite often contact embassies in London or other countries to return items which we have negotiated the release of so that they can go back to their original location. I think it's fair to say that many embassies are not very used to this, and they sometimes look upon us with some concern when we say that we would like to return an item to them, and they worry about insurance and freight and all sorts of other issues, which you can imagine in the bureaucracy of an embassy may be rather important. But we've attended many ceremonies where the museum in Thailand or whichever country it may be have sent a representative over to London or Washington or wherever to receive an item which we have been able to return to them. And cultural issues are increasingly important diplomatically. I mean, soft power is a rather vulgar expression for it, but every country has the ability to use its cultural assets in order to improve its relations with other countries and its relations with other communities and populations. And we have helped that. And indeed, I'll give you an example of that, which is it's controversial. Not all the archaeologists agree with me. Before the 1930s, it was common for universities who had archaeological departments to put together an expedition to go and do an archaeological dig in a certain country. And they would do that with the agreement of the host nation and an agreement that they could take 1/3 of the items that were discovered, and the government would take 2/3, and they would jointly put together the scholarship to allow those items to be displayed and studied. Now, that was considered somewhat, since all the people doing that were coming from the West, it was considered rather colonial. But actually, we need to find ways in which more funds can go into countries who are seeking to try and protect their antiquities, have many sites which are open to looting. And one of the ways to do that is to get more archaeology done in a responsible way, properly researched, and a deal done whereby you could have some properly licensed items which can be sold on the international market and help people understand more about that civilization.
I think a lot of people have seen the movie Raiders of the Lost Ark, in which he returns from, I think, the Amazon, and he has a few items, and he's thanked by a rather British accented actor, and said, of course, we're appreciative and we'll sell them on and the museum will pay you your fees. That was an old model and somewhat of a Hollywood model, if you will. But the reality is it takes money to conduct archaeological explorations, and they always start in libraries. They end up in the field, and most of the time it takes years before a discovery is made. What kind of model for funding those kind of cultural artifacts in archaeology, what funding model might reasonably work as opposed to the old academic model, which has been branded as somewhat colonial?
A model that I've been working on with one country is that a private investor, but also a philanthropist and a benefactor. So it's not, he's doing this for reasons beyond pure financial gain, would pay for the creation of a museum on a site which needs extensive excavation. So he would put together the money for the museum and for a hotel nearby. And the money, he would also provide much of the money for the archaeological research in return for taking 50% of the revenues for X years from those who come and stay in the hotel or visit the museum. Now, you need an extremely attractive site with, you know, nice beaches and palm trees and everything else to make that work. But it's not impossible. But there aren't many countries who are sufficiently far-sighted and sufficiently commercial and sufficiently interested in tourism and open to this sort of joint venture to make that work. But that is a model that we have to pursue. We've got to get away from the fact that something is either government 100% or private, and never the twain shall meet. We've got to find a way in which we can marry the two together in order that they can complement each other and get things done which neither can do on their own.
I think of government restraints that are specifically the reason that archaeological sites are raided, looted, destroyed for construction. So that is a very interesting model that I think we can talk more about in the future. I want to talk now about the issue of cultural heritage and artifacts such in disputed territories. Russia is now illegally occupying Crimea. They have been conducting at a feverish pitch excavations. We will never really truly know what's taken out of the ground there. A lot of that history will be lost to us. And yet we see it popping up in museums in St. Petersburg, the Hermitage, other places in Russia. Do you have any role in protecting those kind of sites or tracking the artworks that might flow from them?
The answer is we may not have an involvement now, but we will almost definitely have an involvement later. And the way that that will come about is that one day the Russians want to exhibit some of those items that they extracted from the Crimea. That's probably the right word. And to do so, they want to be able to make certain that those items are not claimed by Crimea, by Ukraine or some other country who is bordering them. And to do that, they need a clean certificate. And they will not be able to get it because they won't be able to say that they excavated this item with the agreement of the host country. And we cannot record on the database items which were looted illegally out of the ground because we don't know what they look like. And but what we can provide a lot of help to law enforcement and so on by making certain that items that we have to check have got a full provenance and pointing out if that provenance is unlikely to be correct. And there have been a number of items where the provenance has been made up or indeed left out. And we've been able to say to the British Museum or some other authoritative body, don't you agree that this has probably come from the Palace of Nineveh? And they say, oh yes, there's a photograph here of the palace before it was raided. And there is a copy, there you can see the image of the item that's now on the market. So although our database is less effective in relation to antiquities illegally excavated than it is in relation, let's say, to a picture which has been stolen or an antiquity which has been recorded in a museum and then stolen, we still have an important role. And we have a further rather important role in that all the antiquity dealers who are members of the association are supposed to check everything they own with us before they buy it. And if they don't, that's almost grounds for arrest.
I want to talk now about a very famous case, the Hobby Lobby incident in the United States, where the owners of this retail store had a deep interest in biblical artifacts or things related to that era. And they seem to have knowingly purchased multitudes of artifacts from the Middle East, many taken from Iraq or from the Daesh, and imported them to America as retail items. What can be done to stop the export and import of stolen, looted, disputed artifacts?
The first thing that can be done is to educate the public that buying these items is dangerous financially and legally. But there will always be people who can be misled or for the thrill of it think that even though it may be illegal, it's worth their while having a punt at it. So we have to tackle this problem both at the demand end and at the supply end. So if a country is having difficulty in stopping items being illegally excavated and exported, we have to try and give them some support. But that is difficult because there is often widespread corruption, borders which are very difficult to control, people who are desperate for sustenance and money, and therefore are prepared to involve themselves in crime in a way that they would not do if they could make a living out of farming or tourism or something else. So I don't want to pretend that this problem is going to come to an end quickly or easily, and it is hugely made worse by conflict. Conflict immediately undermines the government's credibility. It increases the amount of looting done by armed forces and others. And the breakdown in law and order means that the items can't be tracked. So I have no quick and easy answer to this, but the case involving the American citizen who has agreed never to buy any more items and to return all the ones he has, that is going to be a very salutary lesson, with some other cases which are going on at the moment, to everybody in the antiquity world, that it's not worth collecting and not worth dealing in these types of items unless they have a absolutely proven provenance, that they came out legally or before there was any law to prevent that from the source country.
And I think you're speaking of Michael Steinhardt, a Wall Street investor who has just returned $70 million worth of artifacts so they can be repatriated to their countries of origin. Now, I want to be clear, the Manhattan District Attorney was investigating him for a crime. He has legitimately claimed that they were purchased in good faith, and he is voluntarily returning them without any criminal charges being laid. But as you say, a $70 million sting is a disincentive to collectors to engage in this kind of market. So let me ask a couple of last questions if I can. Are there international laws that govern the ownership and repatriation of artworks that are lost, looted, or disputed?
Yes, there are, but they are not as effective as we would like them to be. There are two parts to the international legal agreements. The one part, which is UNESCO, deals with items which are owned by the government or illegally taken out of the government's soil. And those who've signed up to the convention, which is the majority of countries now, has started making it quite difficult for those antiquities to be bought or sold if they came out, I speak now rather loosely, after 1970. But you also need laws to deal with private property, because not all of these items were owned by the state. They might well have been owned by a private individual for 300 years who then sold it. And those laws in each country on the private ownership of property are very, very different and varied. And we constantly have problems trying to reconcile the legal position in, let's say, a country like Italy with the legal position in a country like the United States. Because in Italy, if an item is sold at auction, it conveys immediate good title. It's a public sale. So the law is now not favoring the victim, it's favoring the good faith buyer. In America, you would not get good title from an auction like that. And therefore, we spend a lot of time, which is one of the reasons why you probably need a private organization to do it, cutting deals with all the people involved in order to get a resolution, because the law is expensive, slow, and it's 100% or nothing. So the law will say it's either owned by A or B. A may have a very good argument for it, but so has B. The real fair deal is 50-50. So you sell the item and divide the proceeds or something like that. And that is far more effective than the pure legal route in many cases. there has been an attempt to harmonize all the laws about stolen property, but you can imagine the difficulty of trying to do that across 100 countries.
Well, I know in the United States, in law school, we're taught about diversity of citizenship. If someone from Missouri wants to claim Missouri law and someone from New York wants to claim New York law, it goes to the federal courts. There's 50 states, multiple jurisdictions in the US. Multiply that now times every country in Europe, every jurisdiction. I can imagine the headache. Justinian wouldn't be able to come up with a code that would cover that, no matter how many years he had. I want to get a quick glimpse from you about the hot issues today. What are they? What should diplomats be concerned with? What are the things you think that will captivate our attention, rightly or wrongly, for the next few years when it comes to looted, disputed, or lost art?
If I was a cultural attaché in any country, besides obviously dealing with, the current pop concert or whatever was top of the priority list, I would be really interested in what can be done to develop greater cultural knowledge and interchange between countries and between regions and so on, by increasing the flow of knowledge and the lending of items. The lending of items does pose issues of insurance and freight cost and so on. But I don't think we're very imaginative about the way we do that. And we don't involve private money enough in it. So most of the exhibitions which are done by a museum in Amsterdam with items from Japan or whatever, they get some sponsorship from sometimes an oil company with it, which brings problems, but sometimes from a bank or somebody else, which gets its name on it. And so there is some publicity. And I often think that the government could develop far more of these sorts of arrangements between their own government and other countries if they were prepared to try and get the private sector on. So when the private sector comes to a government and says, we're interested in your changing the tariffs or allowing us to invest or doing any of these things, and we come from a country X, one of the things the government should be saying is, what can we do culturally with this country, which can be linked to this companies wish to invest or undertake commercial relationships. And one of the reasons for doing that is because it removes or makes public any possibility of corruption or bribes or anything is now a public matter. The company wants to open a mine in this land in Africa, and part of that is to help get items repatriated from France to Africa. All above board, all public. They're going to help build a museum, all of that. I think we need to be far more imaginative and far more active in doing that. And the cultural attachés and the ambassadors should be active in it.
One of the issues that has been recently in the news is the Scythian gold. A museum in Crimea, which is Ukraine, loaned them to the Netherlands. Russia invaded and illegally occupied Crimea and laid claim to the Scythian gold, saying that the museum in the Netherlands should return them to Russia. Two very fine young lawyers in the Netherlands working with a barrister in Ukraine, one in the lower and higher courts, that the Scythian gold should be returned to Ukraine. Is that a landmark case, or is it just another decision in a long line of disputes about where artifacts should be returned when states are either in peril or cease to exist?
I think it is both, because it's both a landmark case, but more important than that, I think it's a demonstration of the changing international community view. The days of rape and pillage are over, and therefore, just like the Geneva Convention prohibits the destruction and the taking of cultural assets, and indeed imposes on countries a duty to preserve cultural assets, be they dance, music, anything like that. I think this is all part of raising the moral standards of countries and of conflict and of disputes, so that we reduce the collateral damage to cultural assets. And I think that case was very important because it showed everybody that this Russian aggression would not work in terms of cultural property. And that is probably quite important to the negotiations going on now between NATO and Russia. It's another mark in the sand that everybody's got to behave themselves better.
Well, let's talk about that just for a minute before we close. Obviously, from my accent, you can tell that I'm an Irish American. My father's mother was a Pawnee woman, raised on a reservation, deprived of her language and culture, sent to the white schools, to the point where she was even deprived of her native name. A lot of American museums hold Native American artifacts. The Native Americans would like them repatriated. There's a constant mantra of, but we're better able to care for them than you. We can exhibit them, which is to your benefit. So we have a colonial history. The British obviously have a colonial history. And the biggest point that's come up lately, again, is the Parthenon marbles. Sicily has just returned a fragment to the Parthenon Museum. Does that model of return provide an opportunity for Britain to engage with Greece in a new dialogue about the repatriation of the marbles? Do you see that happening, or will it continue to be a situation where British museums say we are better able to care for these?
Yes, I mean, the British Museum position is not just we look after them well, it is also that even though it was agreed by Turkey, an occupying power, the taking of those items to the British Museum was not as flagrant and as bloodthirsty and as desperate as many of the other things that British troops, British interests did. So the return by Sicily of the fragment is in some ways not that important a precedent in relation to the Parthenon marbles. I think the answer to the Parthenon case is that these items have got to be shared in terms of exhibition, shared in terms of revenue, shared in terms of study. And if there could be a real guarantee that they would be available for exhibition internationally back in the UK or wherever, then sending them, and they are quite important, massive pieces and take some money and insurance, but sending them back to Greece for a period of time, then maybe to Holland or wherever, and then back to London. That's the sort of thing that we should be doing. They should be part of a great exhibition, not just of themselves, but of everything associated with them, which come from many different museums in the world and come from Greece itself. And we should be arguing about how we can divide up the revenues rather than just worrying about who owns the thing 100%.
I want to ask the last question, and it's, what can diplomats and governments do to better assist UNESCO to promote the preservation of the arts, artistic treasures, cultural and historic artifacts, so that we don't see more Buddhist statues disappearing under the Taliban, or seeing the Daesh destroy property at Nineveh with sledgehammers. And I might add, and correct me if I'm mistaken, the Daesh were very famous for publicly destroying artwork, but then selling much of it on the criminal market to fund their enterprises. Am I right there?
Yes, I mean, nobody knows the numbers or the amount, but certainly it did happen.
So what can be done to bolster UNESCO? And is that the right place for us to orient our attentions?
It is certainly one of the places that we must orientate our attention. I mean, one of the problems of the international organizations like UNESCO is that the politics between the USA and other countries, or between other countries and not necessarily the USA, complicate the issue for UNESCO to complete its task. And UNESCO has not had a very good record in the way it's gone about some of this. And the reason for that is that its standard of some of its civil servants on secondment from countries has not been good enough. So at one moment, UNESCO, rather foolishly, published some photographs in support of an argument, and the photographs were actually wrong. They were not of the right items. So these were items that were legally owned and had been legally exported many, many years ago. And UNESCO just took them out of a photographic album, as it were, and stuffed them in an article about illegal activity. So UNESCO has not been perfect itself. We need to improve its staffing, improve its resources, but also every country, including Britain, Scotland, Ireland, everywhere, has got to do more to understand and preserve its own culture before they spend their time accusing other people of not doing the same thing. And that is not just in relation to archaeological items, it's in relation to everything, dance, music, everything that makes a nation such an interesting and important cultural asset.
Well, Julian, I want to thank you again for taking time with us. These are very important issues, not only for us today, but certainly for future generations. They will be very thankful, I think, if we do our jobs well and do them better. Thank you again. Tell me, before we go, about the book that you feature in.
Yes. This book is written by Professor Anja Shortland, who is a professor of political economy at King's College London. She wrote a previous book on the whole problem of kidnap negotiations and the relationships between government, the private sector, insurers, victims, etc., from which she was able to demonstrate pretty conclusively that the private sector could undertake some of these negotiations more effectively than the government, because the private sector could say there's no more money. And the private sector was not under the same pressure that the government might be from the media about freeing a daughter and so on. She then said she wanted to do a book on the art loss register and the interesting cases. I sent her a palette, a complete palette full of files, over 30 cases. She chose 10. She wrote them up in what everybody says is a very thrilling way. And yet there are very good, clear, serious lessons at the end of each chapter about the ways in which governments and the private sector and the art trade and the public and everybody else can improve and provide greater deterrence to crimes against cultural property. And I hope you've been able to at least dip into it. And I hope that other people might buy it, because it is, I must say, a very good read.
I have to tell you, I read it over the holidays, found it fascinating. It was like reading a Jeffrey Archer novel. And it really gave me insights into the commonality of how things, like you said, from kidnapping to dealing with artworks. It was a fabulous work, and I would recommend it to anybody to put it on their shelves. And we'll feature the book here and give a link to where it can be purchased. Julian, thank you for your time. We really appreciate it. I'm Miceal O'Hurley, and you've been watching In Conversation this week with our guest, Julian Radcliffe, OBE, of the Art Loss Register. Julian, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much.
All right. So we'll hear from our sponsors, and then we hope to see you again soon. Stay safe.